A new book is shaking the very foundations of thought on the causes of poverty and underachievement. It strikes home particularly hard in America, where group ethnic and racial identity are strong. In The Economics and Politics of Race, Dr. Thomas Sowell says that Chinese, Jews, and Japanese are overachievers, and blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans are underachievers. And it's all due to culture. I'm Tony Brown. In a moment, The Ethnic Flaw. You identified human capital in your book, and you say, now you tell me if I'm not paraphrasing you correctly, you say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't.
Tony Brown's Journal is brought to you by Pepsi-Cola Company and your local Pepsi bottlers.
The Economics and Politics of Race. Dr. Sowell, you have written what I consider to be one of the most exhaustive statements I have ever seen on an awfully complex subject. I'm really not sure that I understand it that thoroughly, so let me begin by trying to get some general understanding. Are you saying that in a culturally pluralistic society such as America, are you saying that the variable in success or lack of success is the culture of the particular group?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying it not only for the United States, but in terms of the studies of various other countries around the world, the same thing seems to be true. You not only find the same group having the same characteristics in country after the country. That is, the Germans produced the first pianos in Australia. They created the piano industry in the United States. They built the first pianos in England. They built the first pianos in Russia. You look at the Chinese, what they major in Malaysia in college is what they major in the United States in college.
Namely science and
science and technology, heavily. And this follows the group around the world. So the notion that the group is a creature of society, that society has shaped the group, just will not stand up to the facts.
If you say that culture is the variable in success, which means conversely, culture is the variable in failure, and you cite the phenomenal achievement of West Indians, which is the largest black immigrant group in the United States.
Yes.
Their phenomenal success in the United States, I think they earn about, second generation earns about 15% more
than the average American.
Than the average American. But they don't do well in their own native countries, and they don't do well in England. Now, if culture is the variable, why is that a fact?
I guess you'd have a selective migration coming into this. That's also true of other groups, by the way. The Chinese are prosperous everywhere in the world except China. The Indians are prosperous throughout Africa, but they are in terrible shape in India. They are prosperous in Malaysia. They're prosperous in other parts of Burma at one time. There are many groups which, when freed from the constraints of their particular society, burst forth with all the other abilities that they have. In their own homes, they're throttled by various other factors.
Now, you also delineate the migration of the African from Africa through the Caribbean, if that took place, and then into the United States. And you distinguish and you document the difference in the form of slavery that took place in the West Indies and the form of slavery that took place in the United States, and you relate that to the performance of the two respective groups.
Yes. In the light of what you've said, though, and in the light of recent studies of England, you can't push that too far because, in fact, in the West Indies, the Chinese are disproportionately the entrepreneurs. But of the West Indians who come to the United States, you have a very heavy selection factor going on. You have that with most immigrant groups, by the way.
What do you mean selection factor?
That is, the average person of the average country doesn't get up and leave and go to some other country. It's the person who is unusual, is not in ability, at least in attitudes and other kinds of things like that. That's also common around the world. When people go into, let's think of the Japanese who come to the United States, the Chinese who come to the United States. They do better than the Chinese who were born in the United States. Whites who come to the United States do better than whites who were born in the United States.
Isn't that true of all immigrants as compared to native-born Americans?
Yes, and compared to people of the same ethnic background. So that's true in Canada and in Britain. White immigrants to Canada do better than white Canadians. White immigrants to Britain do better than white Britons. So you have a very heavy selection factor going on.
Okay, now after we've all settled here for a generation or two, and we are all what we call America, which is a culturally pluralistic society, different cultures living side by side, we then have kind of shaken all that immigrant edge off, haven't we?
Not really. Because second and third generation, well, second generation West Indians, as you point out, keep on going up the ladder. These things last varying amounts of time. Sometimes they last for centuries. You have groups, for example, like the Germans who settled in Russia. They settled there for 100 years. They left Russia the same people they were when they came there. Many of them still didn't speak Russian. They continued the German that they'd already had. The habits were completely German. And they came to the United States, they were completely German. And they settled out in the far west, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and so on, and have a pattern of life that came straight out of Germany as if they had never been in Russia.
Well, what is it in American life today? You cite 6 groups in 2 categories. You cite Jews, Chinese, and Japanese as overachieving groups. You cite blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans as underachieving groups. Now, what are you describing there? What have you identified there as a variable?
Oh, income. Well, the achievement is measured in terms of income and occupation. That is economic achievement. Obviously, there are other kinds of things that make up life. But, and I wouldn't want to stigmatize groups as permanently underachievers. If you look at generation by generation, you find incredible changes. The black population especially. The change in occupations of blacks between the 1920s and the 1950s is just phenomenal. So that what we're watching are people who, for cultural reasons and historical reasons, begin behind a certain level and have not closed the gap. It's like a relay race. You don't say that the runner is a bad runner because he hasn't closed the gap when he started 50 yards behind. If he's 40 yards behind now, we don't call him a failure. We say he's made up 10 yards.
Well, I'm sure you do know the conventional wisdom in America is that every immigrant group to this country, with the exception of blacks, has closed the gap.
That's not really true. It depends upon what time frame you're talking about and how you define the groups. The Chinese who've come here from Hong Kong and other parts of China since the Second World War are in dire poverty in many parts of Chinatowns of New York, of San Francisco, Los Angeles, in many cases far worse off than the average black. So that isn't true that every group has done this. Blacks started much further behind. I don't think people realize how much further behind blacks started and how much progress has been made. There's a distinguished economic historian, Robert Higgs, who has said that for blacks to go from being completely illiterate in the middle of the 19th century to being 1/2 literate and by 1900 is just an amazing achievement in the history of the world, that you very seldom find that kind of change that quickly. So it depends on what you're holding as your standard.
The standard is that blacks haven't caught up with whites.
But whites haven't stood still.
You make another point in terms of intra-black relations, and that is, you say, affirmative action, for the most part, has really benefited blacks who really didn't need affirmative action.
Affirmative action is a great way for black PhDs to get endowed chairs. It's a terrible way for some kid in the South Bronx to try to get his first job. What affirmative action does is create an incentive for people to hire those who have a proven track record, those who have degrees and things like that. It makes it more dangerous for the employer to hire an untrained person with no track record, because if he has to fire that person, then he's letting himself in for legal trouble. Whereas you can hire a white of very doubtful qualifications, and if he doesn't work out, throw him out in the street the next week. You hire blacks of doubtful qualifications and throw them out in the street the next week, and you've got the NAACP, you've got the EEOC, you've got God knows who all to contend with. The employers have long ago figured this one out, and so they have not hired those blacks who are at all doubtful, either in terms of qualifications or simply not enough experience to know how good they are. You see this in the data. Blacks who have education and who have experience have been moving up on whites, and in some cases overtaking whites. If you look at blacks who have not finished high school, blacks who come from background of families that are broken and so forth, they are falling further and further behind, not only further behind the population in general, but further behind whites with the same disadvantages.
What do you blame for that? You're not blaming middle-class blacks who are beneficiaries of affirmative action, are you?
I'm blaming the incentives created by affirmative action, because when it comes to the incentives that are created, the businessman is going to try to protect himself whatever way he can, and that means hiring those blacks who are overqualified, who have a long track record and so on. And that's what all the data show, that for example, black couples where the husband and wife are both college educated now make more money than white couples where the husband and wife are both educated. But the black female-headed family has lost real income in absolute terms over the past several years and has fallen further behind white female-headed families. So the very opposite trends are going on at the same time. And you can't argue this because of blackness or racism, because both of them are black people. One group is shooting way ahead, one is falling further and further behind. And a large part of that reason, I believe, and the data seem to suggest, is because the incentives created by affirmative action and similar kinds of programs just make it too dangerous to take a chance.
Now let's go back a little to culture as the variable. Let's attempt, if you would, for me, delineate the difference in the impact of culture on West Indian blacks as compared to Native American blacks in terms of performance.
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand you, but I guess what I see is that in terms of performance, let's say in the school systems, studies were done ages ago showing black West Indian kids doing better than black American kids in the public schools, where they both sat side by side. This again is not unusual. The same thing has been found if you look at Mexican and Japanese kids sitting side by side in California, that the Japanese kids will score 20 points higher on the IQ, which is the same as that between blacks and whites in segregated schools. So that whether you're sitting together or apart doesn't seem to make very much difference. What matters is what kind of attitudes you take into the school system and how you make use of whatever's done there. Unfortunately, in so many of the school systems where blacks are today, in ghettos particularly, the education offered is so terrible that there's not an awful lot that can be done.
Now, you have gone around the world and looked at groups of varying backgrounds. We now have an influx of another wave of influx of immigrants, particularly from the East. Many of these groups are settling in black neighborhoods and going into business and so forth, and there is now some friction and a lot of debate about that phenomenon. What is it in their culture that you see that relates to their entrepreneurial performance now, and I would say achieving entrepreneurial performance in black neighborhoods?
I really couldn't draw out a list for you, but what I could do is say that this is true of these same groups throughout Southeast Asia. It's true in Guyana, in Panama, in Peru, in Jamaica, that the Chinese have been entrepreneurial in all these areas for centuries on end. For example, in much of Southeast Asia, the Chinese own over half of all the rice mills in the country, even though the Chinese are only about 5% of the population of these countries. It's true of other groups, the Germans in Russia under the Tsars. At one time, all the members of the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences in Russia were Germans, even though the Germans were only 1% of the Russian population. So this is not an unusual thing, and it's particularly not unusual for the Chinese.
Well, tell me, what groups are coming here as a result of the chaos in the East, in particular?
Well, from Vietnam, the boat people, 70% of the boat people were Chinese. And one of the reasons it was so hard to settle them in the Far East was they were hated. That groups, wherever there are groups that have skills that are lacking in the larger society, from an economic point of view, they're very valuable to that society. From a political point of view, they are invariably hated. This is true of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Jews in Europe, the Indians in East Africa, the Igbos in Nigeria. You run through the whole list, it's exactly the same kind of reaction.
But are you saying there's something in the black culture that prohibits them from doing what these Chinese boat people do when they come from Vietnam?
No. What I'm saying, I look at it entirely differently. I don't ask what is the cause of poverty. Everybody is born poor and ignorant. The question is, what factors allow some groups to get from that position? Blacks, first of all, started further back and are coming forward. And at this point, there simply has not been the pattern of entrepreneurship in the black population. That's been true of other groups, such as the Irish, for example. The Irish are doing quite well today, but they're not doing well in entrepreneurial occupations. They're in the law, they're in the church, they're in this, they're in that. And on the bottom line is they're doing better than the average American, but they're not doing it in those particular fields. Every group succeeds in some particular area. Blacks who win Nobel Prizes don't win them in the same fields that the Chinese win Nobel Prizes in.
You identified human capital in your book, and you say, now you tell me if I'm not paraphrasing you correctly, you say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't. A study was done in San Francisco schools. to show Asians, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and how they score in various fields and mathematics in particular.